My sixth tip on reading the Bible is wrestle with the hard bits. You'll often find when you read the Bible that you'll come across something which just seems challenging, whether that's because you don't know what it means, or it's because you're fairly sure you do know what it means, but that's an incredibly challenging thing to read and figure out what you should do with that, how that fits in with the modern world, how you should react to it. It's quite tempting to skip over them and ignore them. And I think it's actually really important that we wrestle with them, that we try not to look for pat answers, that we take our time to see what these texts have to say to us. I wonder if you've ever skipped across something when you were reading it. I bet you have if you've been reading the Bible a little bit. I was just thinking the other day about some of the hard bits that I'd read recently. For example, Hagar and Sarah in Galatians chapter 4, where all of a sudden they're compared to two mountains, and the analogy seems quite odd and like a bit of a left turn from what Paul had been talking about previously. Or the challenge of Romans 9, that very difficult text talking about God's desire perhaps to save some, but maybe not all. Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. What do we do with that? And the hardening of the Pharaoh's heart, again, how should we think about that? I was reading in 1 Samuel not so long ago the story of the witch of Endor, where Saul visits this medium and who he asks to call Samuel up from death so that he can give him some answers. And then that seems to be what happens. It's a very odd text and slightly hard to understand, not just exactly what's going on, but how we should think about that. Or in 1 Peter 4, that strange passage that talks about how baptism saves us and exactly what we should understand that word saved to mean. But even more bizarre, that's a couple of sentences before, talking about the spirits in prison and Noah and his family, that as you dig into the commentary seems to be about the Nephilim in one of the early parts of Genesis. Very confusing, slightly esoteric text. What should we do with that? Well, without wanting to give you the answer to each of those, because while I could, the point of these videos is to encourage you to read the Bible, what we have to do is choose to wrestle with them. We have to choose to take our time, to choose to understand that perhaps we don't know exactly what it means, but to then take the time to go and talk to others, see what others have understood it to mean, to see if the context around it makes it any clearer, to perhaps read some commentaries or talk to someone who has, to understand what the author of these particular texts is getting at and what that has to mean for us. I'd encourage us to avoid easy answers. Sometimes we would be tempted by them because it allows us to move on. And it is helpful to get the broad thrust of a passage and move on to get the big picture. But if we find that the obvious answer doesn't actually deal with everything that the text is saying, then we should continue to wrestle. And sometimes it's helpful to move on for a bit just to get the big picture, or because you haven't actually got the time right then to wrestle with the text. But don't forget that you want to come back to it and take your time with it and see what the Bible has to say to us. So how do you go about wrestling? Well, firstly, you do it by taking time and taking the time to read the text slowly and keep reading it and see whether or not actually it unveils what it has to say as we take time with it. Secondly, we do it in community. We bring our questions to other people and we talk about them together and we discuss what we're finding hard, and somebody else may well have read a different part of the Bible recently which sheds light on it. And thirdly, we do it by using scholarships. There's people out there who've devoted their lives to writing books on what these things mean. And either we access them ourselves or we talk to others, perhaps your pastor who has accessed them, and then we find what answers they have to give us. And always we take those answers back to the text, we test them against what it has to say, and we test them against what else the Bible has to say, so that we can see together what these difficult texts mean. So my sixth tip on reading the Bible, wrestle with the hard bits.